request review comes from my good old friend Zappa Slave, who's been encouraging me to do this review for quite some time now. We're going to be talking about the Gundam spin-off film produced by Canadians known as G-Saviour. This film is infamous, and I do indeed mean it lives in infamy. If you've never heard of the film, it's probably because Gundam's creators and producers over at Sunrise don't want you to remember that it exists. And in fact, I called this movie a spin-off a little while back, but that's perhaps not exactly accurate, because Sunrise totally intended for this to be canon. This was supposed to be a huge, beautiful swan song, a celebration of the 20th anniversary of Mobile Suit Gundam, which first began its Japanese TV broadcast in 1979. And now? Well, G-Saviour, released in the year 2000, has all but been abandoned by parent company Sunrise. And it's not necessarily that the film has been removed from the Universal Century canon, but rather that Sunrise just sort of quit acknowledging its existence and sort of hopes that you'll forget they ever agreed to put their name on it. That sounds pretty bad, right? Sunrise doesn't even want to acknowledge their own semi-illegitimate child? So just how bad is it really? Well, first we have to ask just who Sunrise left up to the task of creating this film in the first place. Canadian production Polestar Entertainment produced this film, and not much else. Certainly nothing else before it, and only one thing after it, and well, that doesn't appear to be very good either. My understanding is that there was very little communication between Sunrise and Polestar, so Polestar was sort of left up to their own devices during the production process. Now, the good news is that this movie takes place in the Universal Century year 0223. That makes it 70 years removed from Mobile Suit Victory Gundam, leaving it plenty of room to hopefully not step on the toes of pre-existing canon. And for the most part, it does that just fine. To a fault. Because this movie is only just barely Gundam at all. In fact, be prepared to never hear the word Gundam ever uttered over the course of the film. It's not even in the title. You're lucky to hear the words mobile suits near the end. But even then, the appearance of a mobile suit or anything even remotely looking like a Gundam is on screen so little you almost could have made this a completely different science fiction movie. And maybe it would have been better that way. Based on this, you almost can't judge it as a Gundam property and instead have to judge it based on its cinematic merits. So let's start by talking about plot. If you're a Gundam fan, forget the Federation, it's gone, collapsed. It existed, but not anymore. In its place is a new Congress called Consent. It's like the Federation, with Federation dudes in it, but different, I guess. Also, the space colonies are looking for independence. Meet Mark, an ex-Consent soldier who has taken on a new life doing undersea harvesting of some kind.
Oh, she may be old, but she's still got a few good moves in her.
After a dangerous thing happens where he rescues a guy who fell into the ocean from space, which then has no impact on the plot, a congressional task force is sent to the underwater facility with a guy named Jack at the helm, whom I guess worked with Mark at some point in the past.
They don't move until I give them the word. Unlike some of my former soldiers.
Hey, Jack.
There are other intruders in the base, and Mark finds these intruders stealing stuff from a lab. The task force arrests at least one female intruder. Then there's a sudden cut to sometime later where Mark and his girlfriend, Mimi, go to some presidential ball, where Mark is asked by General Garneau to interrogate the intruder they captured.
Why me?
Well, because you're not a soldier. Maybe she'll trust you.
So he does so, meeting with Cynthia, a scientist from Gaia. Also, she's played by Enuka Okuma, who's also the English voice of Lady Un in Gundam Wing.
I'm the chief biotechnical engineer on Gaia.
She explains that there's a food shortage and that some previous science done in that underwater lab could solve the food crisis. Mark is convinced and helps Cynthia escape. They go to the lab and find samples that make water glow, and somehow that's supposed to solve a food shortage. It soon becomes a rescue mission to take Cynthia, her other escaped rebel friends, and the sample back up to Gaia, and then save food for all of the space colonies. And by the end of it, there's a badly CG'd mobile suit space battle over the whole thing. The G-Saviour mobile suit is in it. Mark pilots it, woohoo! Aside from having next to nothing to do with any prior Gundam continuity, perhaps G-Saviour's biggest problem is that it's incredibly mediocre. Somewhere within the script of this movie lies a story that could probably be elaborated upon in ways far better than what this movie was able to illustrate. But given that this movie was made for TV, it seems it doesn't have the budget to do all of the in-depth things it tried to tell us were going on. It suffers from a huge problem I have with any visual storytelling media. It tells us everything, but it doesn't show us everything. We're told that Mark has a history in the military, but we barely see any of it except for the most minuscule of flashbacks that only involves interior shots of him inside his cockpit. We know that Mark used to be under the ruthless command of Jack because they have petty squabbles over decisions that were made, but we don't actually see any of those bad decisions in action.
We wouldn't be talking like this if hydrogen had produced the crop yields that it promised. All that money and all you have to show for the seaweed.
Sorry, Jack. What was the last stroke of genius that society culled from the military?
We're told that the colonies are suffering from a food shortage, but we don't actually see any suffering from any of these communities that leads me to believe that there's actually a problem. In fact, all of the locations we ever see in this movie look to be pretty well off, so there's a pretty big disjunct between what they say is happening and what we actually see happening. And I just have to come back to this biosample Cynthia discovers in the lab that she claims is going to stop the food crisis. See, I figured that what they were looking for was something that could multiply food cells or something, making it virtually a scientific feeding of the thousands. But no, what they found instead was bioluminescence, glowing water. There's no real explanation as to how glowing water is going to solve a food crisis, unless all of the food is trapped in dark places nobody can explore because they don't bring lamps with them or something. We see the sample safely reach Gaia, but see no implementation of it to show the audience how they finally solved hunger. It makes no sense at all. The cinematography in G-Saviour is really lackluster, which I guess makes sense when you consider it's supposed to be a made-for-TV movie. The camera does next to nothing dramatic at all throughout its full hour-and-a-half runtime, except for this one scene at the congressional party where the camera just sickeningly keeps spinning in circles. Maybe since it's a made-for-TV movie, that also explains all of its other low-budget production problems. Clearly, they couldn't afford to show us poverty or a hunger crisis, but we also have a whole lot of really obvious ADR. It's clear they didn't get good on-set audio for at least 30% of the movie and had the actors come back in to re-record many of their lines.
Dieter! There's gotta be another way around this!
Negative, Mark. There is no clear path.
On top of these scenes, the soundtrack for the most part is an electronic orchestra played out on somebody's Yamaha keyboard and sounds a little more like an after-school PBS broadcast than an epic, thrilling space adventure. And then there's the mobile suits. They're barely present at all throughout the film, but when they're there, they're incredibly jarring against the rest of the realistic scenery and practical shots. It's been 16 years now, and the CG hasn't aged well at all in the slightest. And by the time we get to the final space battle and we finally get to see some beam saber fights, it's hardly thrilling to look at all. The mechs move throughout space like they're moving through molasses. Big, slow, and kind of doofy and dumb, and you just don't feel the impact of the clash of sabers at all. The mobile suits aren't illustrated as being able to do very much at all, and look to be inferior to other mobile suits from 70 years or more in the movie's past. The actors themselves aren't especially horrible, but they're completely a product of a made-for-TV movie, just as mediocre as the rest of their surroundings. The end result of the movie really isn't so much their fault. After all, I have to assume they did the best that they could with the material that they were given. But I kind of didn't end up much caring about anybody in this movie. Mark has a little bit of a backstory, a reason to hate being a military man, and a reason to hate Jack, who was previously his superior officer, who made him make battle decisions he didn't agree with. But I can't overstate how much I don't care, because it was all told and not shown. Jack, on the other hand, is just a jerk with military power for the sake of being a jerk with military power. He isn't a character written with any other motivations, so he's just an unlikable dick. Cynthia flirts with being a likable character, however, that's only because she gets captured for trying to do the right thing, and we only know she's doing the right thing because she says so, not because we actually see the results of the right thing having been done. Then near the end of the film, Mark cheats on Mimi with Cynthia, and Cynthia's okay with that, so never mind, neither one of them is likable. Mimi figures it out, and out of a need for revenge or a personal desire for Mark, she nearly destroys an entire colony by telling the military where the sample is, so, you know, she's a terrible person too. And just about every other character you run into is visited only briefly with no delving into their characters or personalities, so you can't possibly begin to grow attached to any of them at all. As I somewhat stated throughout the course of all of this, G-Saviour is simply mediocre in just about every way you can imagine. This by far is not the worst movie I've ever seen, but when you're coming at it from the perspective that this was supposed to be a 20-year anniversary project, it absolutely did not live up to expectations. If you're a Gundam fan, you may be more emotionally attached to the franchise and feel more let down and offended by what was presented in this movie. If all you're in it to see is a science fiction story, well, it's a mostly understandable story, but it's wholly unexciting, with firefights where people can't hit their targets, and lackluster space battles that look like they might almost get exciting, but then never get all the way there. I mean, if they dropped the license with Sunrise and just tried to make a sci-fi epic about solving a food crisis among space colonies, then maybe actually gave us decent character analysis and showed the condition of the colonies, then maybe we would be having a different discussion right now. In fact, there are some Gundam fans with a soft spot for G-Saviour. And I think I might understand where that minority is coming from, because I truly think that had this been handled differently, the story could have been okay. If they hadn't been afraid to use the word Gundam, if another production company had been the one on this, and if the distribution was handled differently, maybe this story in the Universal Century wouldn't have been swept under the rug. In fact, a PlayStation 2 game based on G-Saviour came out not long after the movie's DVD release, taking place not long after the events of the movie, featuring a different cast of characters, all speaking English, though they aren't especially great voice actors.
Be aware that we'll initiate the bombing 10 seconds after your departure.
With really creative looking mobile suits, an interesting enough story, and not so bad looking gameplay. That soundtrack is kinda alright too. Like really, they could have really done something with the storyline, and instead we now just ignore that it ever happened. Oh, except for that one time that Sunrise put G-Saviour into Gundam Build Fighters. So maybe they haven't completely forgotten it exists after all. Oh. Well. I guess that shows the general sentiment of G-Saviour even amongst members of its parent company. Just about the only rewarding thing to this movie, then, are the appearances of actors who either already were or would become Gundam voice actors. Aside from Enuka Okuma, there's also Sam Vincent, who shows up in the final dogfight for like a second, who would later go on to voice these guys across various Gundam properties. Furthermore, I don't completely hate the design of the G-Saviour, but it's sadly associated with a property that most people try hard to forget, and so its existence is forever tainted. And that's about it. If you're in North America, there's no means of buying the DVDs from anyone other than resellers. Bandai stopped printing the discs in 2002. You can still buy the Japanese DVDs that also have a Japanese dub, but even those are still copies from the original printing, indicating nobody's been buying them over the last 16 years. I mean, you can get the DVDs pretty darn cheap off Amazon. Also, there's this G-Saviour Gunpla model kit that's semi-expensive now, but they only made so many of them 16 years ago, so yeah, if you really want a model of G-Saviour, just be prepared to pay a little more money than it's actually worth. Well, now that we've brought G-Saviour back into the public consciousness, what else can I talk about? What would you have me review? Check out patreon.com/MarzGurl and give me a TV show, video game, or movie that I can review for you. Looking forward to working with you soon.